It's a classic storm scenario.
I take it you're not showing me this in order to demonstrate the awesome power of nature, Brian.
They kill Les Darcy and they poison Parlack, so you be careful.
And here's the single that wins the match. He's out!
Now that's one marvellous way to make compost, and it works beautifully.
This is truly, truly heavenly.
Oh, come on.
No matter how small, every town has one. Maybe just the obelisk, a few names inlaid. More often, full-scale granite, marble digger, arms reversed, long descending lists of dead. Sometimes not even a town. A thickening of houses or a few unlikely trees glimpsed on a back road will have one. 1919, 1920. All over the country. Maybe a band. Slow march. Mayors, shire councils, relatives for whom print was already only print. Mates, come back, moving into unexpected days.
By the 1950s, a unique Australian society was firmly in place. 2 world wars were behind us, and we felt we'd earned our time in the sun. Since then, we've fought in 5 more conflicts, transformed our defence forces, and learned to become peacekeepers. The Anzac legend and 100 years of military history have helped to shape our nation and our people. Almost 2 million Australians have experienced military service. It's part of our national identity. Yet being in a war is an intensely personal matter, different for each individual. Far too often that experience has meant sacrifice. Australia's century of war has been at the cost of more than 100,000 lives. For some, the experience has never ended.
And to this day, there's not a day goes by that I don't think about Vietnam. It is so much a part of you that you can never, ever shake it. And I think the main reason for that is the way we were treated when we came home. We were second-class citizens, and we thought we'd done a great job. We were very proud of what we did. We did our best, and we came home to a pretty bad reception.
I put it out of my mind when I came back. Put the war right out of my mind. That's why I never joined the RSL or never took any part in anything like that. War celebrations or that, I avoided them.
If you've witnessed it and been there and done it, you remember it, but then you try not to remember it. And this is the whole thing. I have been trying not to remember, and I think we all do that.
Marvellous what man can stand when he's got to. We've got a purpose driving him.
Over the centuries, it doesn't seem to me that war has ever achieved very much. No wars.
But as we celebrated our 100th birthday as a nation, among the crowds were many families who have not been affected by war. The Australians who gathered together in 1901 had already been engaged in 3 conflicts. The past, it is said, is another country. Back then, the taking up of arms was seen as the responsibility of voters and landowners. The price of having property and rights was being prepared to defend them. Today, we are not as comfortable with military matters. We prefer to have professional forces to fight on our behalf and in our interests. At the turn of the century, Empire interests and British heritage were thought of as identical to our own. Now that legacy must take its place among all the other nationalities that call themselves Australian. In 1901, they faced the beginning of a century. We face a millennium. At such times, people take stock and try to predict the future. Then as now, hope and trepidation were in the air. As 1900 approached, Australia was enduring one of the worst droughts since white settlement. The hard times strengthened many people's faith in the Australian character as a tough and independent bushman, conveniently ignoring the fact that most people lived in cities. We were reaching out to the rest of the world. In Paris, Freddie Lane was the first of our Olympic gold medal swimmers, and Nellie Melba sang her way to 23 curtain calls in Vienna. We saw ourselves as one of the youngest children of the empire, with common ties of race, language and culture. Many called themselves Australian Britons. In 1870, 2 years after the last convicts arrived, the British government withdrew its forces, but by then we were taking responsibility for our own defence. Each colony had units of civilians carrying rifles and wearing uniforms. They were competitive and keen to make their mark. Hero, General Charles Gordon, was speared to death by Islamic rebels in the Sudan in 1885. They grabbed their chance. The newly laid telegraph brought the news to Australia just 2 weeks later. Upstaging the other colonies, the Premier of New South Wales immediately offered an expeditionary force to avenge Gordon's death. Like many country towns, Bathurst rallied to the cause. Their volunteer rifle corps had been training for nearly 20 years. Now they could be put to the ultimate test of manhood. Picnics were held, concerts performed, and money raised. Finally, 19 sons of Bathurst in brand new uniforms caught the train to Sydney. 770 volunteers sailed from Circular Quay, and 2 out of every 3 Sydney-siders cheered them on their way. It didn't matter that we had no connection with the Sudan. Britain was there, and that was enough.
To arms, ye sons of Austral's land. Your queen has bid you fight. You go a well-chosen band to fight for Britain's right. Go then, brave boys, though you are far, far away, to fight for freedom's joys, for your country's sway. Then make the Saracen lie bleeding. Go then, brave boys, though you are far, far away. March on, all hearts resolved on victory or death.
It wasn't quite victory or death. The Sudan fizzled out into what was described as a paltry affair. Between the farewell and the war lay the reality of distance. And by the time our first volunteer soldiers to fight overseas reached Africa, it was all but over. They fought in just one small skirmish in which 3 privates were slightly wounded. The rest of the time they built camps and guarded the railway. But they did encounter the man who was to have a long and controversial influence over Australia's fighting forces. Major General Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener, hero of Khartoum, Gordon's holy avenger, and the most empire-minded of soldiers. As a war, the Sudan was a disappointment. But Australians had shown that they would rally to Britain's cause, whether they asked us to or not. Imperial feeling in Australia was almost a religion, and we were keen for another chance. The Empire provided it in South Africa. The Boers, like Australians, wanted freedom. The British wanted control. Fierce political resistance by the Boers turned into armed confrontation.
Well, we were fighting for possession of the things that they had. They had diamond mines and gold mines, and if it hadn't been for that, probably we wouldn't have been there.
England's forces on our frontiers were increasing, and we knew to what end. We had therefore as men no choice but to send out the challenge immediately, before the odds became impossible and before we were quite at bay. War was bound to come, for the Boer and the Briton despised each other, and would never have been satisfied till the dispute had been settled by arms.
The British had enjoyed a century of military victories. Complacent and at first badly led, they were unprepared for the Boers' commando tactics. Within a month, the unthinkable had happened. 3 towns, Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith, were all under siege. The Boer leader, Uncle Paul Kruger, had spat in the face of the Empire. Some Australians took it personally.
I'm coming, Paul Kruger, to have a talk with you. A word into your ear, old man. I am the kangaroo, the emu, and the possum, and the eucalyptus tree. In other words, Australia. And this I say to thee, now, Mr. Paul Kruger, just let my father be.
Others wanted nothing to do with any kind of militarism. 40 years before, aggressive police work by the British military saw 28 diggers killed while demanding their rights at the Eureka Stockade. And though the troops were supposed to protect the colonies from external attack, they fought alongside white settlers against Aborigines and Maoris to free land for farming. Some Australians were anti-military, others anti-empire. Why, they asked, should Australians be used by the British to shoot down Boer farmers who were also demanding their rights? Henry Lawson, a contributor to the Bulletin, reacted in a passionate and angry mood.
Some of us are willing, willfully, blindly eager, mad, to cross the sea and shoot men whom we never saw, and whose quarrel we do not and cannot understand. Our cry is for England, or blood is thicker than water, and so we seek to blind and deceive ourselves as fools, unanimous in their eagerness to sacrifice right, justice, truth, everything, to satisfy their selfish craving for what they consider a picnic, to have some fun, to have a spree.
But opposition remained ineffectual. The men wanted to go. The press was generally enthusiastic, and the British, criticised by other countries for their bullying tactics, were keen to have Australian support. Queensland jumped first. The young Captain Harry Chevelle assured potential recruits that the war would be a grand picnic with very little risk. In Toowoomba, Colonel Ricardo challenged the manhood of his recruits.
Those who are willing to go to the Transvaal stand on the right of Sergeant McClellan, and those who are going to stop and grow pumpkins stand in the ranks.
When the first New South Wales contingent marched to Circular Quay, 300,000 Sydneysiders braved the rain to cheer. Only a few lonely voices raised a protest. The men who boarded the ship began the experience of Australians at war. They had about them a distinct look and were tall, fit and strong. Mostly unmarried, they were generally aged in their mid-20s.
Long-legged fellows, brown and hard-faced, and all with the alert, wide-awake look that distinguishes the Australian soldier from the more stolid English Tommy.
If infantrymen, they probably came from the city. If mounted, then the country was most likely their home. Though they fancied an adventure, they had little military discipline and no knowledge of the art of war. But they were ready to prove themselves. When they arrived in South Africa, the landscape astonished them.
The country that I travelled or served over was mostly veldt, South African veldt. And that would be masses of plains, miles and miles of plain country, interspersed here and there by small mountains or hills called koppies.
It's no place for foot soldier. They'd have to be cavalry. They'd have to be mounted because it was all rough open country.
So they led us a pretty wild dance, you know. And they were fighting for survival. No spirit of adventure that prompted them into it. They're fighting for the survival.
On the first day of 1900, Trooper Victor Stanley Jones was shot dead in South Africa. Australia had its first sacrifice. The 27-year-old Queenslander was the first of the century's 100,000 war dead. He was in a 5-man patrol under Lieutenant Alfred Adie. Sent out to scout by their British commander, they rode to a small farm called Sunnyside. The enemy saw them first. Adie was thrown off his horse, hit by 2 bullets and badly wounded. Victor Jones died instantly, shot through the heart. With the curious premonition that comes to soldiers in war, Jones had spoken of his own death that morning.
As Victor was riding away, he seemed to me to be more reserved than usual. So I said, "Cheer up, Victor, you'll soon be dead." And instead of his usual reply, he said, "Yes, Ben, old pal, you're right this time." And I was never afterwards guilty of saying those words to a man. He cured me of that kind of horseplay.
It was their first combat, and despite the fact that they won, it was in truth a minor affair. At home, though, anxious for any proof that we were equal to the British, the newspapers played it up shamelessly.
The Queenslanders behaved magnificently, and while under fire, chatted and laughed with the utmost sang-froid.
The Boers, heavily outnumbered, avoided head-on battles. They would hit and run on battlefields that covered thousands of kilometers. They were commandos, well adapted to the country.
He was a wonderful shot and a wonderful horseman, but that was all we ever saw of him. You never seen nothing, no hand-to-hand fighting. They'd hide behind some rocks and fire at you, and then as soon as you get, they're off. And you had to either chase them or stop where you was.
Only a fortnight after Sunnyside, our reputation was shaken in an afternoon of bloody chaos. Lieutenant Willoughby Dowling's patrol of 21 New South Wales troopers was heading back to camp when they were attacked. Dowling reacted like many of the new Australian officers, with confidence, daring, and inexperience.
Dowling turned his rifle on the attackers, but he was soon down with a bullet wound in the head. Then he was on his feet again, only to be felled by a shot which blew off his thumb. But he rose again, firing away with his revolver. 2 bullets in the legs dropped him by his dead horse, but it was a blow on the head with a rifle butt, which finally quietened the Mudgee lieutenant.
Dowling was captured along with 13 others. The next day, an anxious Australian search party followed the noise of vultures feeding on dead horses and found 1 dead and 1 dying Australian. There was an inquiry that found no one at fault, but the Australians were retired to a rest camp away from the action. British command felt that they were poor soldiers. The great adventure was turning a little sour.
The constant snap and sniping of the foe you never see makes you wonder, will your turn come? When and how? As the Mauser ball hums past you like a kind of vicious bee. Oh, we're going on a long job now.
Banjo Patterson was the war correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Argus. He was 35 and at the height of his popularity. He relished his characters, the bushman soldiers.
The English troops, as a rule, have a heavy, vacant, chore bacon look about them, while our compatriots, on the other hand, looked smart enough to steal a policeman's watch if they were given half a chance.
But by the time he left a year later, he saw no honour or glory in chasing a few Boers from hill to hill. He was disillusioned and weary of the war.
When the dash and the excitement and the novelty are dead, and you've seen a load of wounded once or twice, or you've watched your old mate dying with the vultures overhead, well, you wonder if the war is worth the price.
The man who gloried in the British race now yearned for an independent Australia.
We will carry our own flag up to the front when we go to the wars again.
Patterson hated the devastation of his much-loved horses as they died in their thousands on the veldt. None of the 40,000 Australian horses returned home. During the war, 500,000 horses and mules were shot, blown to pieces in battle, or simply worked to death.
You went to sleep in the saddle. The horse would be taking you along and you're fast asleep. You'd go night and day. And you'd only stop and dismount when you was told to.
The war entered its first year, but Australia had problems of its own. A bubonic plague spread by rats. In the bush, the drought had reached disaster levels. Australia, harsh and unforgiving, forced its people to rely on each other for survival. When Australian medical teams went to South Africa, the compassion they had learned in hard times was not left behind. They were valued above all others, and they were badly needed, for this was a war where sickness was as lethal as bullets. Disease killed half the Australians who died during the war.
Not allowed to drink the water in case it was poisoned. Not allowed to drink the water until it had been analysed by a doctor. And if the doctor said it was all right, we'd drink it. If it wasn't, we had to either go without or drink the slime out of the ponds. And that was really the worst experience.
Albert, Harry, Herbert and Walter Tame were brothers from Wingellow in New South Wales who went to war together. Only Albert returned. Typhoid took the others.
Funerals, alas. As many as 20 a day have passed this place, which is near the cemetery, and always 7 or 8 in the afternoon. And as I write, they're sounding the last post on the bugle at another funeral.
One Australian nurse watched helplessly as 5 of her charges died, one after the other.
One was terrible. Quite mad, but often so touchingly gentle and so grateful. "Ah," he used to say, "that's splendid," as I was bandaging his poor face. And the night before he died, he asked me to kiss him.
The New South Wales Army Medical Corps commandeered this building and set up their hospital. They took in everyone, Australian, British or Boer. Fittingly, it was a doctor who was awarded Australia's first Victoria Cross. Captain Neville House from Orange in New South Wales rode to rescue a trumpeter brought down by enemy fire. Though his horse was shot from under him, he continued on foot, treating the man under fire, then carrying him to safety. We were awarded 6 Victoria Crosses in South Africa, not for killing the enemy, but for saving others. The Australians could ride, shoot and live off the land as well as the Boers. Finding them, though, was another matter. Then, in an unlikely place called Elands River, they found the challenge they'd sought. "500 men were garrisoned at Elands River, including 350 Australian bushmen. The Boers wanted the plentiful supplies in the camp and attacked. During the night, around 2,000 Boers wheeled their guns into place.
Shelling started in the grey light of morning. It was a perfect hail of bullets and shells, north, south, east, west. They came in simultaneously. We were and are completely surrounded. The big guns are completely out of our range. We have only a 7-pounder, which is completely useless.
One man was lying with his arm blown away, and a great hole in his side, such as is made in the earth by a shovel. As I lay by his side, the shells flying over us, he rocked from side to side in agony.
1,000 shells were fired down on them. Trooper Wardell was the first man killed. His mates carved his name on a piece of slate, making it his gravestone. That first night the shelling eased, and men dug literally for their lives. Bayonets hacked into the ground, and digging tools were so scarce that the price of a pick was £3 for half an hour. For 5 days they were pinned down. Then the Boer commander called for their surrender. The story goes that the Australians' commander was given no choice in his reply.
"Even if I wished to surrender, and I don't, I am commanding Australians who would cut my throat if I accepted your terms. I don't expect your artillery will change the minds of these men."
Though given up for dead, the Australians defied the Boers for 2 weeks, patrolling at night, killing silently. It was the stuff of legend. If Banjo Patterson had been at Elands River, its name might have been as familiar to us as Gallipoli.
They were the only troops who could scout into our lines at night and kill our sentries while capturing and killing our scouts. Our men openly admitted that the Australians were more formidable opponents and far more dangerous than any British troops.
After 10 days, the British realized they were still holding out. Kitchener led 20,000 men on a forced march to relieve them.
Oh, it was a grand sight to see the columns coming in. As far as we could see through the glasses, the column extends. Lord Kitchener congratulated us on the stand we made. It was reported we had surrendered.
"80 men, 1 in 5 of the defenders were casualties.
When the ballad makers of Australia seek for a subject, let them turn to Elands River, for there was no finer fighting in the war.
The British told them they would receive official recognition for their bravery. Nothing eventuated, and many Australians believed it would have been different if they'd been British.
And who were the moving spirits in this glorious addition to the list of the stories of British arms? A few score colonial youths, mostly Queenslanders, with no military training to speak of. You may not see much of this magnificent defence in the official reports, but let me say that very great jealousies of colonial troops are noticeable here.
Australians were dying in South Africa. Yet when the Empire called for help in another nationalist uprising, the Boxer Rebellion in China, away we went again. The entire navy of South Australia, the cruiser Protector, sailed to China. The senior British naval officer was delighted to see them.
I have never seen a finer body of men, clean and smart-looking. Our country is fortunate to have so many staid and disciplined men willing to volunteer for active service. Remember, you're doing good work for Queen and country. They call you the Australian contingent. A very good name. But remember, we regard you as the British contingent from Australia.
The men cheered his words, but again, we arrived late. The 55-day siege of Peking was over, and they could do little except to help clean up the mess and loot vigorously. 6 Australians died, all from illness. In South Africa, the Boers had adopted guerrilla tactics, and Kitchener tightened the screws. He denied the Boers any civilian support by what we would later call a scorched earth policy. Boer farms were systematically attacked, looted, and burned. Women and children were taken to concentration camps, so called because they concentrated the civilians together. Some Australians were uncomfortable with their new duties.
We cleared the country by burning all farmhouses, and the poultry fell to the victors.
Chasing the farmers out of their cottages and their families and burning them down. That's what we didn't like. We had to do that because they would get behind us and shoot us from the back.
There was no honour or romance in harassing women and children, even less in herding them behind wire fences. Conditions in the camps were appalling. Emily Hobhouse, an English morals campaigner, reported her outrage in British and Australian newspapers.
In many instances, I was an eyewitness of what took place. I saw families huddled up close to the railway lines. I saw crowds of them along the railway lines in bitterly cold weather, in pouring rain, hungry, sick, dying and dead. I never had any doubt that every female countryman of mine would have felt just as I did at the sight of all this, with a profound feeling of compassion, burning with the desire to alleviate the suffering.
Kitchener was unapologetic.
Extermination is a long and very tiring business. They seem as fanatically disposed to continue this war as ever, and I fear it can only end by our catching all, or almost all of them. It's very hard work for our men. I try all I can, but it's not like the Sudan, and disappointments are frequent.
The concentration camps did not have the horrific intent adopted later by Hitler. But through neglect and poor planning, 40,000 men, women and children would die in them by the end of the war. Little of this was reported at home. The war had become tiresome and slow, and Australians were preoccupied with federation, the joining of the 6 colonies into the Commonwealth of Australia. Australians had long wanted to be one people, without mixing with other races. They saw their northern neighbours as an economic and cultural threat. Unity was critical. So on a sultry Sydney morning in January 1901, Federated Australia was born. Immigration restrictions were rushed into legislation, and our first National Defence Force was born. The 4,000 men of the Australian Commonwealth Horse sailed for South Africa in 1902. The war was over before half of them arrived. But they were our first national force, wearing uniforms with the letters AC on the shoulder straps, upturned slouch hats, and for the first time, the Rising Sun badge. A tradition had begun. Before the new federal force could even try on their uniforms, other Australians in South Africa were being cursed as cowards. On a cold winter's night in June 1901, 350 recently arrived and untrained Victorians were camped in a farmyard at Wilmansrust, settling down to sleep. 140 Boer commandos slipped past their sentries and, running forward, fired from the hip at point-blank range into the men lying round their campfires.
I fired so quickly that I hardly kept count of the cartridges in the magazine. But I knew that when the gun said click, it was empty. I forced in another 5 cartridges, and then another 5 in the same way, all of which I emptied into a wall of shouting and excited human forms, weirdly lit up by the campfires.
The Australians panicked and 18 men were killed, more than in any other single action in the war. A court of inquiry censured the British officer in charge, but it savaged the Victorians.
In considering the chicken-hearted behaviour of the officers and men of the Victorian Mounted Rifles, we must remember that they were recruits and that their behaviour was only what was to be expected in the circumstances.
Their commander, the British Major General Beatson, did not hold back either.
I tell you what I think. The Australians are a damn fat, round-shouldered, useless crowd of wasters. In my opinion, they're a lot of white-livered curs. You can add dogs, too.
Stung, a Victorian trooper, James Steele, spoke out against Beatson.
It'd be better to be shot than go out with a man who calls you white-livered curs.
He was court-martialed along with 2 others for incitement to mutiny and sentenced to death by firing squad. Kitchener commuted the sentences to imprisonment. In Australia, the press berated the men for their humiliating defeat and mutiny. But there was also unease that Australians under British command could be sentenced to death without the knowledge or approval of the new federal government. More embarrassment was to follow. The war was in an even more erratic phase. The British controlled the Bushveld Carbineers, a mostly Australian unit designed to act independently and irregularly against the Boers. One of these patrols was led by Lieutenant Harry Morant, called the Breaker, because of his horse-riding skills. Over the years, Morant would be transformed into an Australian legend. But in a grubby incident, Morant and Lieutenant Peter Hancock were accused by their British masters of murdering Boer prisoners. They were court-martialed and convicted. Their defence was that they were acting under orders.
Could have had the decency to measure us first. Don't suppose they've had many complaints.
I'm going to find out the grand secret. I will face my God with the firm belief I obeyed my orders and served my king as I thought best. If I overstep my duty, I can only ask my people and country for forgiveness.
Despite appeals for mercy, Kitchener ordered their execution.
Hey! Shoot straight, you bastards! Don't make a mess of it!
The British did not consider it necessary to inform the Australian government of the deaths. The Australian press disowned the men, and the public appeared to be ashamed of them. Morant and Hancock were buried on top of each other in a simple grave at Pretoria, near their execution site. Only one of the Australian war dead was returned home. Their bodies buried on the veldt or interred in nearby cemeteries, often sharing the consecrated ground with their Boer enemy. After 31 months, peace was finally negotiated in May 1902. Despite a few failures, Australians were now accepted and admired by others in the Empire. They'd shown courage, endurance, independence and initiative, all the promise of exceptional soldiers.
If there had been a few more Australians, the war would have ended much quicker. They were the only type of men that were capable of checkmating the tactics of the Boers.
Many who returned were disappointed that the jobs they expected for their efforts did not happen. But monuments did, erected by the public all over the country. We were now called a nation, but we fought in South Africa for the Empire, and most of the monuments reflected this belief. We thought of ourselves as Anglo-Australians. Australians believed they had an absolute right to protect themselves against Asian invasion. Previously, we depended on imperial might, especially the Royal Navy, to keep us safe from harm. Now the argument turned towards self-defense. In 1903, Parliament debated and passed the Defence Act that laid down two lasting principles. In peacetime, our military would consist mostly of civilian soldiers, and in time of war, no man could be compelled to fight overseas. But we had no national anthem and no national flag. The colonies had not formed a nation, they'd simply united. In defence, Australia needed powerful friends. Prime Minister Alfred Deakin invited the United States government to send their Great White Fleet to visit us. The news was greeted with headlines and cheers. On a spring morning, 16 ships of the American Navy steamed into Sydney Harbour. The city went wild.
There's a grand and noble fleet that we're called upon to greet and welcoming to Australia's sunny shore. From the mighty USA, they are sailing on their way. A hearty cheer awaits them, I am sure. When they reach our sunny land, we'll extend a friendly hand and treat them all as brothers, taunt and true. For when all is said and done, as a race, we all are one. All descended from the old red, white and blue.
Australia became the first self-governing country in the empire to buy and own a navy. We instituted a naval college and financed and eventually crewed all our ships. A citizens' army was planned, but there was argument about how to achieve it. Deakin wanted a volunteer force, a defence of the people, by the people, for the people. But Billy Hughes, the ambitious Labour politician, believed all able-bodied men should be trained, whether they liked it or not. He wanted a rifle-wielding electorate capable of war. Encourage shooting, he said, till it becomes the national sport. Hughes won. Eventually, if you were male and aged between 12 and 26 in Australia, you were compelled to undergo military training. Thousands defaulted, but the system was largely successful and the size of the militia increased by 50%. Keen to have the British seal of approval on compulsory military training, the government invited that old friend of Australian soldiers, Viscount Kitchener, to visit us and prepare a report. It started badly. In Brisbane on his first inspection, only 250 cadets turned up for parade. And a column of tired troops marching past him barely managed to raise a salute to the great man. During his 7 weeks in Australia, Kitchener travelled inland only once, to Bathurst. He was to unveil the Boer War Memorial, finally completed 9 years after the war. The hero of the empire was coming, and Bathurst was enthralled. The names of the local men were all there, all except Lieutenant Peter Hancock. It was Kitchener who had upheld his death sentence. Peter Hancock was living and working in Bathurst when he enlisted for the Boer War.
I'm not much of a letter writer, you know. If you ever heard from me, it'd probably be bad news.
His widow Bridget had only learned of his execution from a newspaper article. Still angry, she threatened to bring her 3 children and disrupt the unveiling. At the last minute, she was talked out of the inevitable embarrassment. Today, Hancock's name appears on the memorial as an add-on, the result of over 50 years of lobbying by his son and other family. Recently, another plaque was added, anonymously in the night, below Hancock's name. Its 3 words indicate deep feeling still, 100 years later. Kitchener's main legacy was to recommend the establishment of the Royal Military College, Duntroon, to train young officers. He also suggested charging students a fee of £80, but the Labour government refused to allow elitism in the army. In the first class to graduate, the principal cadet was the son of a carpenter. Across the Molonglo River on a clear autumn day in 1913, Australia's new capital was announced. Lord Denman, the Governor-General, laid the foundation stone, and Lady Denman declared the name to be Canberra. The band played God Save the King, guns were fired, and Prime Minister Fisher called for 3 cheers for Australia. As the shouts echoed across the limestone plains, no one there could have foreseen how soon the troops marching past would be hurled into battle. Nor could they ever have imagined that close by where they now stood, a massive memorial would be constructed. a memorial to commemorate the sacrifice in a war that was about to engulf them and their country.
What the deuce is the bells ringing for? I thought I'll soon find out what's happening. And when I got down to the war had been declared.
I said, well, it's no use worrying about it, Mum. I said, somebody's got to do it. But she didn't say anything, but she had a little bit of a whoop.
Every family had a father, a son, or a brother, or an uncle, or a relative in. So practically every family was affected.
We felt very proud that they were, well, doing their duty. Duty to the empire.
It was really almost the start of Australia as a nation.
Well, they say they're good old days, but they didn't exist. I forget what the basic wage was, but it was very small. My father had a good public service job, but a family of five, you know, we couldn't have butter and jam together and bread, we had one or the other. And my toys were an iron hoop which I used to trundle along with a broomstick, and a two-wheel trolley made out of a kerosene case. They were my toys.
We were busy all the time. Even when I was 7 or 8 years old, I used to have to get up about 6 o'clock in the morning and help milk the cows, There was no milking machines. It was all done by hand, you know.
More self-reliant, I think. We were brought up different anyhow. When you're 9 years of age, you're considered near enough for full grown to do some work about the place.
Work. You talk about work, that was my work at home. We were 9 in our family. I was the eldest girl, so I don't have to tell you any more, do I?
And I could read. I taught myself, you see. And I had a little bit of an education. I left school at 9 years old, just when you'd start to learn anything, you see. And there were 60 used to go to the little school, and only one teacher and a sewing mistress.
There were no migrants there except British, either Scotch, Irish or English migrants. Australia was essentially looked on Britain as the mother country, and they talked of Britain as home, even though they'd never been there.
We didn't think of ourselves much as individual Australians. We were part of the British Empire and dependent entirely on England.
The King, God bless him, the Empire, and then the land we love, Australia. The King, the Empire, Australia.
We did learn a little bit about previous kings, and I personally, I think that's from what I'd read about them, the way they carried on. I reckon they all had their throats cut.
Being a primitive Methodist family, card playing was out, dominoes were out. Presbyterians were even stronger. The story is told of one youngster was going along with his parents whistling. The father said, "Don't whistle, people think you're happy." It was Sunday.
By 1914, Australia was the most urbanised country in the world. The population was 4.5 million, mostly Australian-born, predominantly Anglo-Celtic. On the edge of the empire, we were white Australia in an Asian world. Vulnerable and remote, we knew we had to defend our island. There was a navy, a flying school, and compulsory military training, but they would never be adequate. We needed to prove ourselves worthy of a partnership with the motherland, and many felt that a war would provide us with the opportunity to do so. On August 4th, 1914, after Germany invaded Belgium, Britain, on behalf of the Empire, declared war. We answered enthusiastically. Our navy was placed under British control, and 20,000 men were offered for immediate service. Within 16 days of the declaration, 10,000 men had voluntarily signed up.
Every able-bodied young man felt it his duty to enlist. And I would say it would have been harder not to enlist than to enlist.
With my education, you didn't know what you was fighting for. Yes, of course, you was fighting for your country, more or less. And I remember they asked me to draw a map of Australia, and I didn't know what Australia looked like, let alone draw one like it.
The response enabled the army to set high physical standards. Only the fittest and the strongest were accepted. They joined the newly named Australian Imperial Force, the AIF. Imperial to remind them of their dual duty to nation and empire. They were largely working class and single, most aged between 18 and 34, and their reasons for joining were as varied as they were.
Oh, they did want to go, you see. it was the money. They was getting such a pay, you know. You only get a few pound a week in those days, and when they got this money, they all wanted it. They didn't know what war was like. They'd never been to war.
The town boys, they weren't quite the same as when you're in the country. I mean, you're brought up with a gun in your hand, as the saying is, and you like shooting, so you thought you'd have a bit of practice when you went away on some of these Germans.
They did not take easily to army life. They knew they were civilians, not regular soldiers. The army, they believed, was their employer, and they resented most attempts to discipline them. Parade ground Spit and Polish did not sit easily with their desire to have a dig at the Hun.
Fighting the Kaiser, who'll come a-fighting the Kaiser with me, and we'll drink all his beer and eat up all his sausages. Who'll come a-fighting the Kaiser with me?
After only 3 months, they prepared to leave Australia. Their training was incomplete, but they went with their country's blessing.
A great vantage point was St Mary's Cathedral. You could go on the steps, and they used to march from Moore Park right down College Street, right down to the Woolloomooloo to board the troop ships.
On November 1st, 1914, Australian and New Zealand troops set sail in the largest convoy ever to leave our shores. Many on board believed the war would be over before they arrived.
It seemed to come to us of a sudden, the fact what we were there for, what we were expected to do. But the one thing that stood most to be answered was, how long before we shall see that wharf? Those faces again? Or who shall not see them again?
Their departure was delayed 4 times for fear of German warships in the region. And they were right. Prowling the oceans as a lone raider, the German cruiser Emden had sunk at least 15 ships and was hungry for more. She was headed for the Cocos Islands when HMAS Sydney received a message warning of her presence. Battle was joined. Sydney shelled the Emden to oblivion.
The whole thing didn't last 40 minutes, but it was a busy 40 minutes. She was a shambles. It must have been 40 minutes of hell on that ship. For out of 400 men, 140 were killed. The survivors were practically madmen. I've seen my first naval engagement. And all I can say is, thank God we didn't start the war.
It was a resounding victory, and our first. Any opposition to the war was swept away in a rush of patriotism. The press and the government helped it along with a flood tide of propaganda that portrayed Germans as barbaric and bestial Huns. Australians took to hating anything German with a vengeance.
I lived next door to a family of Germans and I didn't like them. Didn't like them at all. They were real Germans. I don't know whether they were interned or whether they went over to Germany just before the war started or what, but I never saw them again.
Australian Germans were assaulted, abused and ostracised. German street names were removed. German pianos smashed and people spied on their neighbours. By October, 4,500 residents had been interned.
Just felt sorry for them, I did. I don't know what other people thought. I did hear people say, serve them right, shouldn't be a German.
For now, though, these were the only Germans Australians would encounter. The training camps in England were full, and Turkey had entered the war. So 5 weeks after leaving Australia, the troops landed in Egypt. 2,000 years after the Romans and a century after Napoleon, these men from the New World set up camp near Cairo.
Dear Mother, we are a big camp here and there are thousands of men from all parts. We are just alongside the pyramids. It is something marvellous to see how they could construct such a thing. Cairo is a funny place, very dirty in the native quarter. I would not care to live here very long. There's nothing to see but sand.
The Australians and New Zealanders were combined into one corps under the command of an Englishman, Lieutenant General Birdwood. His signalling staff shortened the title to Anzac. The men adopted the name. Alarmed by the lack of preparation, Birdwood ordered immediate and exhausting training.
It was rotten. Sand, sand, sand in your tucker, in your ears, your eyes, your nose, anywhere and everywhere. It was real crook. We done marching, skirmishing and digging for weeks and weeks. I was heartily sick of it.
Conflict between army discipline and Australian casualness was inevitable. Military offences multiplied.
Some of the boys were coming on parade in all sorts of headgear. Helmets, caps, etc. The CO would ask them where their hat was. I lost it, sir, and so on. Well, said the Colonel, well, you will have to get a hat. I'm not going to tell you how to get one, but get one. That night the Colonel's hat was stolen and has never been found since.
They had left Australia with dreams of glory, but the realities of heat, sand and dust and the sheer monotony of training brought out other aspects of the Australian character. With or without official leave, they descended on Cairo, filling up the hotels, the brothels and the streets, where they gambled and fought.
Oh, I don't know. Got me out the Thursday night.
Make a boat peepers on that.
A little bit more.
I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to ask how much?
20 piastres.
20? Cripes, that's only 4 bob.
Hey, cut it out.
No, this is wartime. In a month we might be dead.
They dubbed Egypt the land of sin, sand, shit and syphilis, and they treated the locals with disdain and intolerance.
We've rather outstayed our welcome here. The natives are no longer fulsome in their admiration now that our money is gone. The pyramids and the Sphinx no longer charm us, and the niggers and their beasts are only a nuisance.
In February alone, 131 disciplinary cases and 24 men with venereal disease were sent home to Australia in disgrace. The intensity of training increased, but the Australians remained disgusted with Egypt. They'd come to fight and were tired of waiting. In Europe, the war was now a deadly arm wrestle. Great armies locked in a stalemate. No one seemed to have a clear idea of how it could be won. Searching for an answer, the British War Council turned to the Dardanelles. If they could control this narrow strip of waterway, then they could eliminate Turkey from the war, open a supply line to their Russian allies, and attack the Germans on 3 fronts. It was badly executed from the beginning. The Allied navies failed to force a safe passage, and so, in Egypt, the Anzac troops were given their orders. They were to sail to the Greek island of Lemnos. From there, together with troops from around the empire, they would take part in an amphibious attack on a narrow peninsula. Australians would come to call it Gallipoli.
We're about to leave for the front, and nothing could give me more infinite joy than to tell you this glorious news. As we've been told that we'll probably land under fire, we are full of joyous expectancy.
Dear Gladys, there is a little matter. We're about to take part in some very severe fighting, and there's no doubt that those who come through it alive will be very lucky. If I should go under, there's no need for me to say of whom my last thoughts will be. Mere written words could not convey my feelings regarding you, dearest. I know that you know, and that is sufficient.
They were told they would land on an open plain and face an inferior enemy. But this was what awaited them. Sheer cliff faces, a tangle of ravines and gullies. The Turks knew an invasion was coming and were well prepared. In the dark, waiting on the ships, the men could not have known of the challenge ahead.
We're getting very near to our destination. Some of us never to return, I expect. It makes one's blood run fast to think that in a few hours we'll be taking active part in the greatest war of time. Many of us untried, all of us fighting our maiden battle.
Now remember, lads, the biscuits and water you have it'll last for 3 days.
The one thought uppermost in my mind as I sit here is that I shall not be found wanting. Shall not find myself a coward.
At 3:30 a.m., the boats pushed off in silence and were steered towards the wrong beach. 50 meters from the shore, the Turks saw them.
The boat's grounded 30 yards before the beach. I jumped into the water, icy cold and up to my waist.
Some laughed and joked, while others cursed with ferocious delight.
We lost 3 on the destroyer and 4 in the boat getting to land.
I waded to shore.
The Turks were close on the beach.
And by that time they'd got our range.
Hear the click of bayonets fitting on the rifles, and then in the semi-darkness our men gave a wild Australian cheer and rushed up the hill.
The 3rd Brigade was the first to land, and they started right with a bayonet charge. Without even firing a shot, captured the first trenches.
One does not forget these things. All we thought of was to get at them.
Over their heads, the naval guns kept up a barrage of fire.
Up the hill we swarmed. The lust to kill is on us.
Clean over a machine gun we went. Men dropped all round me. It was mad. Wild thrill.
Into one trench and out of it. Oh, the bloody gorgeousness of feeling your bayonet go into soft, yielding flesh.
It wasn't until I was near the top of the hill that I realised in the excitement I hadn't even drawn my revolver.
The wounded lay where they fell, and newly landed men helplessly stepped on them. On the hospital ships, the bloody parade began.
They came in an endless stream. Some walking, holding arms or hands covered with blood. Some on stretchers with broken legs. some shivering and collapsed through loss of blood. Every man had at least one wound, and some had 3, 4 or 5 bullet wounds. But nearly all were smiling and very cheerful.
The attack was fragmented into hundreds of small battles, the Anzacs constantly trying to move forward. Above them, as they would be for the next 8 months, Turkish guns maintained a killing arc of fire. By dusk, both sides were exhausted. The Turks had kept control of the heights. The Australians and New Zealanders clung to the lower hills. The Australian commanders recommended immediate evacuation, but it was impossible. Then came the hopeful news that the Australian submarine, the AE-2, had broken through the minefields and entered the Dardanelles. For better or worse, the Anzacs were ordered to dig in. Light rain began to fall, and the men took what shelter they could. They had lost 2,000 killed or wounded, but they'd gained Turkish territory. They had no intention of leaving. Australians had been eagerly anticipating news of their troops in action. They were not disappointed.
Every Australian woman's heart this week is thrilling with pride, with exultation. And while her eyes fill with tears, she springs up, as I did, when the story in Saturday's Argus was finished, and says, "Thank God I am an Australian. Boys, you have honoured our land."
The legend of Anzac was born in those first days. The country innocently celebrated, and tens of thousands more men enlisted. Slowly at first, then relentlessly, the published casualty list grew.
My brother Rex, he was on his way to Gallipoli as reinforcements. He wasn't at the landing, thank goodness. And he was on the way when Leon wrote home and said, "Don't let Rex enlist," because, you know, he was experiencing the nasty things that happen in the war.
All you thought about more than anything was the news you was going to get about the ones that was over there. It wasn't the country you was thinking of, it wasn't the Queen, the King, whoever it was. It was whether they'd going to come back or not, who else was going to die.
Over the next month, the beachhead was made relatively secure. The men had faced the hard facts of death and were now determined to win. Thousands of them clung to the hills and the cliff faces in rabbit warrens of trenches, each hard won with back-breaking labour.
Dear Ted, to get an idea of what this place is like, you want to imagine North Sydney without any houses, no roads, not even a track, and scrub to the water's edge, not a tree on it. It's got very hot here. We would spend our spare time swimming. When the Turk sees a lot in, he sometimes drops a shell in among them. Then a sniper got on the job, and although he would have been at least 1.5 miles away, he generally gets one a day. We get tobacco and matches once a week. Beer would bring any price, but can't be got. Money no object, can't spend it. We get the papers, some of them, about every fortnight.
Their front line was 3,000 metres long and about 1,000 metres from the beach. Always under observation and often under fire, they began turning this toehold on the Turkish coast into home, giving place names to every gully, learning how to cope.
Appleby and I were cooking tea, and it was very funny despite the danger. We would cut an onion, then duck into the dugout for our lives, then out again to give it a stir, and in again as a shell would go whistling by. We were laughing all through, because it was comical.
But exhaustion, monotony and sickness began wearing them down. The decomposing bodies and their own careless attitudes to sanitation brought a plague of flies and disease.
Immediately I opened my tin of jam. The flies rushed in, all fighting amongst themselves. Well, I wrapped my overcoat over the tin and gouged out the flies, then spread the biscuit, held my hand over it and drew the biscuit out of the coat. But a lot of the flies flew into my mouth, all beaten about inside. Of all the bastards of places, this is the greatest bastard in the world.
To go down for a swim, one has to go through the cemetery of those that went under during the first landing. They're buried together just as they fell. Colonels and privates side by side, no distinctions. Here and there one can see a brass nameplate sent from home and erected by the fallen one's friends. Anzac is every day becoming more like a town. The huge stacks of cases and stores make us think when we go down there that we're going into civilization again.
There was virtually nowhere a man could stand, nowhere to relax.
One's nerves get very nervy, having to be on a continual strain of looking, watching and listening all the time. You'll see some chaps walking along when all of a sudden they will duck behind something and get under cover when it is only a steamboat blowing off steam. Everyone laughs at the time, but still nearly everyone gets to doing it at some time.
He was a little infantry lad, quite a boy with snowy hair. Well, I was going out for water. He stepped out of the dugout and walked down the path ahead, whistling. I was puffing the old pipe. Well, he suddenly flung up his water bottle and wheeled around and then stared for one startled second, even as he crumpled at me feet. In seconds, his hair was scarlet. His clean white singlet all crimson.
Dear Mabel, I wish this war was over. Don't feel quite so enthusiastic about things as I did when I started. It only takes a few weeks to make a recruit into an old soldier at this game, but I suppose it was necessary for future peace of the world.
Peace became a passion for some women in Australia, and organisations like the Women's Peace Army endured public and personal attacks. For most women, though, the war was a time of frustration and apprehension. Denied direct action, they involved themselves wherever they could. The Red Cross quickly developed a national network of branches, and women and children provided soldiers comforts and raised money. Their efforts were relentless.
Oh, look, the word raffle was a nightmare. They'd raffle their grandmother if you'd let them. Anything. Oh, I know what we'll do, we'll have a raffle. And then someone, usually one of the bigger farmers, donate something, and they'd raffle it, no matter what it was. They raffled a cow one time, I remember, because we won. My father won the cow. She was a white cow. I can remember that as well as anything.
Everybody knitted. Everybody. Some of the socks that weren't so comfortable, I believe. You did your best.
Some enlisted as nurses. Others cared for wounded soldiers home from Gallipoli. Crippled and maimed men limped off the ships. Many women had now either suffered loss or knew someone who had. Enlistment fell away. The soldiers on Gallipoli had been subjected to propaganda slogans about the Turks, and at first they believed many of them. The Turk was not a white man, a Christian. He was a black fanatic, capable of atrocities and mutilation. They killed every Turk they saw. Their hatred died on the 19th of May when the Turks launched a full-scale charge. I do not order you to attack. the Turkish commander Mustafa Kemal had said, "I order you to die." In the face of lethal fire from the Anzacs, they did die. By noon, there were 10,000 of them dead or wounded. It was the kind of raw courage Australians admired. An armistice was agreed to bury the rotting dead.
In some places, the dead were in heaps of anything from 20 to 100 where our machine guns caught them. In these heaps, you could not tell which head, arm, or legs belonged to the bodies. In fact, parts of them were eaten away with germs. One could have got lots of souvenirs, but for the smell, which everything you handled had.
I talked to the Turks. One of them pointed to the graves and said, "That's politics." Then he pointed to the dead bodies. "That's diplomacy," he said. God pity all of us poor soldiers.
The opposing sides talked and exchanged souvenirs, then returned to fighting. To the Australians, the Turks were now Jacko, Abdul, and Johnny Turk. It was an odd mutual respect.
The Turks sent over cigarettes and a note saying, "Although we are at war with the Australians, yet they are friends." They wanted some bully beef, as they liked it, which was thrown over to them. Also asked us not to throw the cricket balls, bombs, as they didn't like them. They signed themselves, "Your comrades in arms, the Turks."
Once on Gallipoli, there was nowhere to go, and the Australians had to make do with whatever they could scrounge or manufacture. They enlarged their dugouts, furnished them with bully beef cases, invented the periscopic rifle, and made jam tins into bombs.
Like powder, bit of old shrapnel, just a dash of barbed wire, rusty if possible. Tamp it down, add detonator and fuse. Voila!
The weeks dragged on into months, the two sides often no further apart than 12 meters. All around them was the evidence of their continuing sacrifice.
Along the walls of these trenches are at intervals the bodies of both Turks and Australians. The bodies are sprinkled with chloride of lime when the trench is widened. In one place, the foot of a Turk protrudes into the trench. The sole of his boot is covered in signatures. In another, a Turk's leg helps support a bomb shelter overhead. And a little further along, you strike the body of an Australian, buried in full kit, protruding into the trench.
Stretcher bearers carried water up the hill and wounded men down.
The last patient I brought in was shot through the lungs, and I fear had but little time to live. But on the way down, he said several times, "By God, that Turk could shoot well. He got me a beauty, didn't he? I thought I had him well enough, but he beat me easily. I feel pretty bad, and I expect I'm done for. But strike me dead. That Turk could shoot all right."
In late July, a rumor ran through the trenches that another assault was planned. It was true. General Hamilton, the British commander, had brought in thousands of reinforcements in a last-ditch attempt to break the stalemate. The men, sick and weary, resigned themselves to their fate. The Empire forces would attack at different points, try to break the Turkish lines and advance towards Constantinople. The British would attack at Suvla Bay and Cape Helles, while the Anzac objective was the hills above Anzac Cove. On August 6th, the Australians were to charge the Turkish trenches at Lone Pine.
We were ordered to get ready
We started sewing white patches on our shirts, one on our back and one on each sleeve. We sat in our saps and trenches all night and shivered. I can't say we slept. At any rate, I didn't.
It was the most vicious hand-to-hand fighting of the campaign. But the Australians took and held the trenches against wave after wave of Turkish counterattacks. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded after the battle. Other attacks had failed to achieve their objectives. The offensive was falling apart, but still more sacrifice would be made. On the following day, 600 men of the Light Horse Brigade were ordered to attack the Turks at a place called the Neck.
Come on, lads. Unload your rifles. Nothing up the spout. We're going in for the bayonets. No bullets. Unload. Nothing up the spout. We're going in for
4 lines of men, 150 in each line, were to rush across a piece of land 40 meters long and 16 meters wide. 5 enemy machine guns and hundreds of rifles covered every square inch of it, and the Australians would charge with bayonets only. The Turkish lines were shelled in an attempt to give the attackers a chance, but the bombardment stopped 7 minutes early. The Turks scrambled back to their posts, re-aiming their guns. The first line, Victorians, leapt to their deaths.
We knew we were doomed. 23 minutes past 4, we stood on the edge of our trenches. In a few short minutes, the crackle of musketry turned into awful roar.
Most of them fell dead or dying within the first few meters. The second line, also from Victoria, leapt out 2 minutes later. They advanced little further.
Not one got back, except those that didn't get as far, or who were wounded and dropped into dead ground and returned on their bellies. I'm ill. The officers that are here are ill. The whole regiment is ill, the Army Corps is ill, and the news is ill.
West Australians now took their place. The officer questioned the wisdom of continuing, but the Australian Brigade Major, Jack Anthill, demanded they push on. Astonishingly, the 3rd and then the 4th line bravely moved forward to a tragic and wasteful end.
Imagine what it was like. Really too awful to write about. All your pals that have been with you for months and months, blown and shot out of all recognition. There's no chance whatsoever of us gaining our point. But the roll call after was the saddest. Just fancy only 47 answered their name out of close on 550 men. When I heard what the result was, I simply cried like a child.
I'm glad in a way that you're not here. One of the most awful sights I've seen was a poor devil being held down on a stretcher. A total nervous wreck and probably mad. His brother had fallen almost in his arms with his head blown off. It would almost make you cry to see a fellow like that. A chap becomes absolutely callous here. And dead men and other sights he sees have no effect on him. Even seeing one's friends go down seems natural. But I shall thank God I haven't got to see any brother dying. This is rather morbid talk, but it struck me several times. It's a good job Willie can't come, and Jack is too young.
More than 300 Australians died in an area the size of a tennis court, their bones visible still, years later. In Australia, the casualty lists were posted. Among them was Ray's brother, Norman.
He lasted only a week. He was killed at the Battle of Lone Pine. We at home didn't get any advice about how he was killed or what happened to him. We didn't get any information really that we could rely on, and of course it was just quite distressing for me, particularly for me mother and father.
The minister or the priest, when there'd be a fatality, they used to come and break the news to the people. You'd hate to see them come. Yeah.
Poor old Mrs. Brewer. She only had the one son, and her husband was dead, and they just lived together, and they had a nice little farm, and he went to the war and left her there, and she was working and looking after everything. You know, I had to go and tell her he was dead. No one else would tell her, and you know, I still think of it. It's not as easy as it sounds, you know.
Dad was killed today. I worry a good deal about Mum and Reen, and I hope that they will take this awful news in a good spirit. Anyhow, Dad died a glorious death and for a worthy cause, and I know he didn't begrudge his life. God bless dear old Dad.
More assaults were made, but there was no improvement in the uninspired leadership. By September, the Anzacs were only 1,000 meters further on from where they had originally landed. Finally, the major offensives were halted.
What a gigantic conflict this has turned into. The loss of life is appalling. Rivers of blood. The trench is red with the lifeblood of my comrades. Sometimes I weary so of it all and long for peace. It is only the fact that the safety of our loved ones, the integrity of the Empire is at stake, that lifts our spirits up again to face the grim horrors of the battlefield.
Where are the rest of my 13 mates? Myself, I consider lucky, getting away from the acres of dead men. And now I go back there. God only knows what is in store for me.
200 a day were evacuated due to illness.
We've been inoculated again, this time against cholera. We'll be immune from all diseases shortly. Pity we can't be inoculated against bullets.
Blame finally began to fall. There was open criticism in the British press, and General Hamilton was replaced. Not that these things mattered much to the soldiers. In November, the snow fell. Men froze to death, and 3,000 were evacuated with frostbite and exposure. In Australia, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, conducted a war census that revealed there were 600,000 men who had not yet volunteered. He sent each of them an appeal to enlist. White feathers, meaning cowardice, began appearing in men's letterboxes.
The posters all around the town, "Your country needs you," pictures of Kitchener and very much propaganda for enlisting.
I was 17 and I put my age up to 18 and we went down and enlisted. When I so used to horses and things like that, I went in as a reinforcement to the 9th Light Horse.
The men on Gallipoli remained true to their ideals, though most were now stripped of all illusions. They were unfit, malnourished and exhausted, but they'd learned to trust themselves and were still determined to win victory.
The British Army contains many good ones, but there are others who lack initiative, endurance and resource. And God help England if she relies on these last. This war has made me intensely British and absolutely Australian.
Kitchener came to Gallipoli and the decision was made to evacuate. The Anzacs had lived, fought and died as mates, without sentiment but with strong memories of those who had died game. To leave them behind seemed unthinkable.
The last night at Anzac. It hurts to leave this place. And I'm damned if they can say the Australians failed to do what was asked of them. They did everything, more than they were asked. We feel it very much, believe me.
They cared for the graves of their mates, building small fences around them, erecting crosses.
All that sacrifice and all that labour. All that suffering for nothing at all. The flower of Australian manhood dead. Wandering parties of Turks in search of loot trample over them. I feel bitter about it.
The Australian evacuation plan was the most successful operation of the campaign, but for many Anzacs, it was a shameful time. They begged to stay to the end, saying first on should be last off. They did not yet know what the name Gallipoli would come to mean to their country, nor did they see the fires that awaited them. They simply wanted to soldier on.
There's a torn and silent valley. There's a tiny rivulet with some blood upon the stones beside its mouth. There are lines of buried bones. There's an unpaid waiting debt. There's a sound of gentle sobbing in the south.
quite enjoyed it, as a matter of fact. I liked bullets flying and that kind of thing. I like to send a few myself too.
What are we fighting for? I suppose it's for the right to stand up on a soapbox in the Domain. The right to tell the boss what he can do with his job if we don't like it. And the right to start off as a rouseabout and finish up as Prime Minister. That's what we're fighting for.
You reached a stage where you felt if you didn't enlist to get there, the war would be over before you had a chance, and you wanted to be in it. And that was true. I mean, we just felt we were going to miss it, you know. This was an adventure. How silly you can be. Yeah.
After Gallipoli, the Anzacs thought of themselves as a real army. They clung to their ragged Australian uniforms, proud of what they'd achieved in the face of failure. Their faith in the Empire and the British was diminished, but their belief in themselves and their duty was unshaken. Tired and debilitated, they were combined with new recruits and put back into training in Egypt. The AIF doubled in size. But it wasn't long before the familiar monotony and discipline had them discontented and impatient.
It's about time we had another scrap. Our last was on November 16. And we're getting the fighting itch again. The big mistake has been made keeping us here for so long, for we are overtrained, and we have the damnedest own job to keep our men from going to the pack through staleness. We all long for orders to get away to the firing line.
What they wanted was a chance to fight the Germans. The orders came in March 1916. The light horse would remain behind to fight the Turks in Palestine, and the infantry would sail for France. They were protected at sea by ships of the Empire, including the Royal Australian Navy. After their initial success in the Pacific, Australian ships served under Royal Navy command in every ocean of the world. They hunted German raiders, searched for submarines, and took part in the blockade of Germany. It was an unglamorous, often tedious war, but critical to British naval supremacy. The Anzacs landed at Marseille and went by train to northern France, arriving in springtime. Gallipoli seemed another earth away.
It was a little village, and quite nice people, about 60 years of age, you know, and we used to go and make friends with the old lady and do a bit of anything she wanted doing around the place. They were very nice old people. Oh, we got on very well with them. Your feeling was that nothing sinful about this. It's quite, oh, let's have a go, because you might be killed tomorrow. And that was subconsciously the thought. The French girls were willing. They were willing and able.
British command placed them into intensive training away from the front line. Yet again, the Australian character came into conflict with British Army discipline.
You two men, stand fast there. Don't you salute in your army?
Not a lot. Well, we used to, but we're trying to give it up.
Finally, they were sent forward to the Western Front. The front was a line of trenches 700 kilometers long, stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. It was a soldier's nightmare, a bloody stalemate, in which hundreds of thousands of men had already died for a few miserable meters of dirt. To break the deadlock, the British commander, General Haig, began a new offensive. His aim was simple: to break through the German lines. But it would be at a terrible cost. On the first day of his offensive, 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The Australians were ready to fight. They may not have been ready for what would happen, but then no one could have been.
Tomorrow, I will be in the midst of it all. There is something humorous in the situation when I actually come to it. John Alexander Rawes, who cannot tread on a worm, who has never struck another human being, except in fun, who cannot read of the bravery of others at the front without tears welling to the eyes, who cannot think of blood and mangled bodies without bodily sickness. This man, I, go forth tomorrow to kill and maim, murder and ravage. It is funny.
Their journey to hell began in a place called Fromelles. In the 8 months of Gallipoli, they had lost just over 8,000 men. In that terrible first night in France, 5,533 Australians were killed or wounded, including 400 taken prisoner.
My division, 5,560 people in one night. My division, one bloody night, not a month or a year. 5,560 odd.
They thought they knew something of war, but this was beyond any man's knowledge. The twisted architecture of blasted towns, the network of trenches that led to the front. When an attack was on, they would move out into no man's land. Lines of white tape marked their jump-off point.
How long to the op over, sir? About 20 minutes, Bill.
The tension affected the men in different ways. I couldn't stop urinating, and we were all anxious for the barrage to begin.
G'day, Pat. Bud.
their artillery fight overhead, they moved forward, sometimes unchallenged, more often cut down by machine gun and rifle fire. Some would get into the German trenches. Yet in those first few months, they often moved forward where others had not. Amongst the rubble, they would hunt for souvenirs. But their small victories would inevitably bring German guns down on them. It did not take long for them to learn the phrase, shell shock.
Men were driven stark staring mad. More than one of them would rush out of the trenches over towards the Germans. And any amount of them could be seen crying, sobbing, like children. But still the Australians refused to give ground. Men were buried by the dozen, but frantically dug up again. Some dead, some alive.
They were pounded mercilessly day and night, often for weeks on end. At its most ferocious, a barrage would drop shells on them at the rate of 40 a minute, collapsing trenches, burying men alive and tearing their bodies apart.
All is buried and churned up again and buried again. The sad part is that no one can see an end to this. If we live tonight, we have to go through tomorrow night and next week and next month. Poor wounded devils you meet on the stretchers are laughing with glee. One cannot blame them. They are getting out of this. We are lousy, stinking, ragged, unshaven, sleepless. I have a dead man's helmet, another dead man's gas protector, a dead man's bayonet. My tunic is rotten with other men's blood and partly spattered with a comrade's brains.
Rawes was killed a few days later. When the strain became intolerable, or their numbers too low, they were relieved by another Australian division. A few days later, when their replacements were themselves beaten into exhaustion, they were sent back. Though they knew what awaited them, they returned to the nightmare. At Pozieres, a village shelled into dust, Australian soldiers endured the most horrific bombardment of the war. 22,826 Australian men fell here to win 1,500 meters of ground. They believed it was not war, but murder, and it left them with only one bleak goal: to win the war at any cost. Prime Minister Billy Hughes had now seen the terrible losses for himself and went home to raise more troops. He had promised the British 9,000 men a month. Impossible without conscription. Parliament was hostile and he was forced to ask the people to decide through a referendum. The arguments began.
People that had been friends all their lives was bitter enemies. There's one old lady, she had plenty of money, Mrs. Scott. She'd put some sort of an entertainment in the hall on, and we'd only have about 20 minutes of entertainment, and then she'd get up and talk about the war, what they ought to do. She wanted to send everybody to the war. She didn't have any sons of her own. She had 2 daughters, but she'd have them all there.
I wouldn't like to be forced to go myself. I wouldn't have my heart in the business. Different thing, doing things off your own bat and being made to do it. I didn't like conscription.
Hughes censored and suppressed his opponents. He was so confident he ordered a call-up of all married men between 21 and 35, even before the vote was taken. His faith was misplaced. Australia said no to conscription.
The sun rose, a ball of quivering fire. Hurrying in from the east, a wind straight from the furnace. I think this is the most hellish wind I've experienced yet. It sears through the oasis, through our blanket shelters, and scorches our naked bodies. The leather of our boots is shrinking in the blazing sand.
Temperatures over 50 degrees, sandstorms, sunstroke and heat exhaustion were common in Palestine, and the men of the Light Horse struggled to keep themselves and their mounts alive.
With the temperatures 120 practically all the time. And when you'd stop to have a rest, the horses would be a length of a horse apart. You'd get off and just flop down on the ground and lay amongst the horses' legs, and they wouldn't worry about you. They were tired, same as you were.
The Light Horse appeared dashing and romantic, but this was a serious war, fought under extreme conditions. In July 1916, the Empire forces began counterattacks against the Turks. In a series of battles, they pushed the Turks out of Egypt and stood poised to move into the Holy Land. In France, the soldiers could have been forgiven for thinking the worst was behind them. But in October 1916, the rains began.
There was a mud heap. The whole area flooded. Shallows full of water. A lot of the shells didn't detonate. The ground's too soft to detonate them. You had to stay on duckboards. You couldn't get off the duckboards. If you did, you're up there and you're immobilised.
The winter that followed was the worst for 40 years.
Oh, it was cold, freezing. As far as the sun was concerned, it might just as well been the moon. It had no feeling in it at all.
They lived in a futile, despairing world where cold, mud and death chased each other in hopeless circles.
My dear little Ern, this'll be about the last letter you get from me now. As one doesn't know the hour his number is called, and Fritz has a bad habit of trying to put a man's lights out. My word, Ern, the part I don't like is when a chap has to sling his cobber into a hole and say farewell to him. It's a hard thing to see your mates that have had all the good times with you drop dead a few feet from you, and you never know what shell or bullet is going to cut through you. But on and on you have to go. Half mad, half dead, yelling, shouting through a hell on earth, trying to pick the best track through the shell-torn and battered ground, with mud in places up to one's knees and deeper, with bullets passing and whistling overhead. Then Fritz waits with 18 inches of cold steel. Take good care of your parents, and never give them any trouble. I regret all the trouble I gave my mother. Well, Ern, time is scarce, and I have a duty to do, and I must say farewell. By the time you get this, I may well be knocked rotten. I remain your loving uncle, Harry.
If I might only come to you with all my sins confessed, if I could only lay my head upon your loving breast, I wonder, would you pity me or bid my soul have rest?
We just go into the line again and again until we get knocked. We'll never get out of this. Just in and out, and somebody gets stonkered every time. Australia has forgotten us. And so has God.
I wonder, would you pity me or bid my soul have rest? If I might only come to you, then would my life be blessed?
Some simply could not cope. A few shot themselves. Some deserted.
Mateship was the greatest thing that kept you going. I mean, but for mateship, I wouldn't have survived. I'd have packed it up long before. So would everyone.
Well, Jack Cawthon, he was my mate, and he got shot dead. He was next door to me. But I looked down at him, and he just had to keep going, that's all. I never thought about him after that. Too many others getting killed, and you got to look after number one.
By the end of 1916, the AIF had lost over 42,000 men in Europe. Reinforcements continued to arrive from Australia, but the numbers were falling. Early in 1917, the Germans withdrew behind the Hindenburg Line, a network of trenches protected by 50 meters of barbed wire, concrete bunkers and machine gun emplacements. The Australians were ordered to break it near a town called Bullecourt, but British command refused to use artillery to support them, instead relying on the latest weapon, tanks. The Anzac commander, Birdwood, tried to reverse the decision but was ordered to proceed. It was a fiasco. The tanks broke down, the men were left unprotected, and German guns picked them off at will. Australians still managed to do what no other Allied soldiers had done. They broke into the line. But they were tiny in numbers, and when British artillery shells fell among them, the Australians were shattered. Bullecourt was used by British instructors as an example of how not to plan an attack. 80% of the Australians were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and the survivors were bitter. Other Australian troops were thrown in a second time, but the results were no better. Bullecourt savaged some of the finest battalions in the AIF, and though they loathed the British command for its wastefulness, their spirit and aggression were undiminished.
That's one thing I was sure of. If I could see him, I could kill him. I didn't look on them as really human, but just as enemies trying to kill me. You can't allow sentiment to enter into anything when you're in a war. It's just a job to kill someone. That's what the government paid us for.
In the months that followed, the Anzacs led the way across the fields of Flanders as the British enjoyed their first victories in a long time. Messines, Polygon Wood and Broadside Ridge all fell to the Empire. But again, the sacrifice was terrible. From August to November 1917, the AIF had 44,959 men killed or wounded. By now, the rains had fallen again.
Every 20 paces or less lay a body, some frightfully mutilated without legs, arms or heads, and half covered in mud and slime. One dares not venture off the duck border, he will surely become bogged, or sink in the quicksand-like slime of rain-filled shell craters.
The place was called Passchendaele, and the battles here buried the British offensive in the mud, along with hundreds of thousands of men. The Australians, like other soldiers, had lost hope. They clung to their agreed task, fighting on till an end, whether their own death or the destruction of the world should come.
Tomorrow many men must go to their God. If I die, I die. We all must die. The best we can do is to die with good grace.
Very heavy casualties at Passchendaele for no point at all. Going for a piece of ground are useless in any case. Nothing's bad as Passchendaele.
The Middle East War had also fallen into a stalemate. Then in October, General Allenby, the new British commander, planned a decisive blow. The town of Beersheba was a Turkish fortress surrounded by desert and mountains. If they could take it, then Palestine would lie open. The Australians, led by Lieutenant General Sir Harry Chevelle, would spearhead the attack. But to be in position, they had to force their horses across 40 kilometers of desert without water. The only supplies lay in the town. If they did not capture Beersheba before nightfall, all would be lost. Chevelle rolled the dice.
60,000 men have failed to take this town in 12 hours.
How can 800 horsemen possibly succeed in less than 1 hour?
You don't believe they can do it?
No one has ever attempted a cavalry charge against entrenched infantry supported by machine guns and artillery. It's unheard of, sir.
Do you see any alternative in the time available?
Well, no, sir, but
Very well, put Grant straight at it.
It took an hour and a half to line them up. Then at 4:30, in a last chance for success, the order was given. It would be a stunning victory for the Australian Light Horse. Chauvel pushed on, rolling the Turks back towards Jerusalem. In the sky, the Australian Flying Corps bombed and strafed the enemy, supporting Allied ground troops, including Lawrence of Arabia and his Bedouin irregulars. Finally, the Light Horse rode triumphantly into Damascus, and the Turks surrendered.
We are the Ragtime Army, the ANZAC. We cannot shoot, we don't salute. What bloody use are we? And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser, he will say, Mein Gott, what a bloody rotten lot, the ANZAC.
Wherever they fought, the Australians were sustained by a belief in their worth. Though it was not always true, they were convinced they were superior to most other fighting forces, in particular the British.
We had nothing but disregard or contempt for the British generals. See, our own generals were subject to their direction. They were fighting the war in the Crimean textbook, putting men up against impossible positions and heavy casualties, trying to take a piece of ground. It didn't matter in any case. They never got to the front. We never saw a British general at the front. Saw them when they got back to the rest camp. They were probably having their wine and cigars,
We always reckoned the Tommies never had leaders. They had the heads of the hobnobs would be made officers to lead them. They had no officers to lead them. Oh God, I could tell you these stories about when we broke through. We couldn't get up the road for Tommies coming back. That's as true as I sit here. They were coming back that day. They broke ranks, you see.
Since 1914, Australian politicians, the press, and the soldiers themselves had agitated for the bringing together of all Australian troops, our own army, under our own command. Finally, in November 1917, the British agreed, and the Australian Corps was announced. It was almost what we wanted. The 5 Australian divisions would now fight together, but still under the command of a British officer, General Birdwood. The Australian General, Monash, would have to bide his time. The Australian Flying Corps was carving out its own legend. Despite their image as chivalrous, carefree daredevils, the pilots were involved in a ruthless and professional war. They took to the air in flimsy, unreliable craft, tangling with the enemy in vicious dogfights and strafing and bombing enemy troops. By 1918, the Australians had a number of flying aces and skilled, disciplined ground crews. They were part of a revolution in the conduct of war, but paid for it with a shocking casualty rate. The life expectancy of a new pilot in France was 3 weeks. In Australia, the people, like their men, appeared to be exhausted. What had begun as a naive adventure had taken a terrible toll in bitterness and grief. In this volatile climate, Hughes tried another conscription referendum. Australian women took to the battle with ferocity.
To the man who pathetically calls himself a common soldier, may I say that we women who demand to be heard will tolerate no such cry as peace, peace, where there is no peace. Send the pacifists to us, and we shall very soon show them, and show the world, that in our homes at least there shall be no sitting at home, warm and cosy in the winter, cool and comfy in the summer. There is only one temperature for women of the British race, and that is white heat. We are proud of our men, and they in turn have to be proud of us. If the men fail, the women won't.
I was against conscription. I don't think one ought to have sent them there and tell them to shoot someone if they didn't feel like shooting someone.
The country split down class and religious lines. The Irish Catholics, led by the fiery Archbishop Daniel Mannix, were fiercely opposed by Hughes, many of the middle class, and leading Protestant clergymen. It was possibly the most divisive time Australia has ever known. At the front, the men had no illusions.
They all voted against it. That's what buggered it up. You reckon the foolishness of it. It's very when you think of war, what the hell they would have felt more? And what a lot of them heads done. Oh, bloody hell, that was murder. Send them over like a hive of bees. The only chance we had of getting away from the shell fire and whatnot for a few days was when our battalion was too weak to hold a line and we had to wait for reinforcements. But if you're going to have conscription, they're going to be there all the time. We'd never get out of the line.
Australia again refused conscription. The AIF remained a voluntary force throughout the war. In early 1918, with the Americans now in the war, Germany launched preemptive attacks. With courage and skill, they recaptured the ground they'd lost over the last 2 years in just 5 days, and their victory seemed possible. The British had fought to an honourable exhaustion, losing 316,000 men. Along the Somme, the Australians were thrown into the Germans' path, notably at Villers-Bretonneux. With a wild charge and bitter house-to-house, cellar-to-cellar fighting, they drove the Germans out. An English commander described their action as perhaps the greatest individual feat of the war. It was Anzac Day, 1918.
The shells were knocking the roofs off the buildings there, and here comes two fellas down with a pram. I suppose it was full of booze. I don't know what was in it. And they're dressed up as women with big hats on the side of their head like this and dresses. singing, "It's a long way to Tipperary" or some dash thing or another. And the shells bursting all around them. Well, you couldn't help but laugh at them, you know, silly fools. They were liable to get killed at any second.
The Germans were halted, and the Allies began pushing them back. The Australians took to raiding the German lines, killing, occupying ground, taking prisoners, and breaking the morale of the enemy, till most German troops feared to face them. By now, they'd been in the line for months, rather than the normal 3 weeks. Yet even inaction brought its own dangers.
At times when there is nothing doing, I think of all things and I feel tired all through. I feel as though I've lived far beyond my span and I need a great rest. It's better not to have too much thinking time.
After April 18, when we went down the Somme, that the whole of the Australian Army Corps was put under General Monash. He was taken in charge of the whole Army Corps. So we had an Australian general in charge of the Army Corps, with Australian generals taking instructions from an Australian. So there was a feeling of confidence that didn't exist before.
Well, Monash, of course, he was a planner, really, very exact. When he drew up a battle plan, it was really exact.
Monash had a reputation for meticulous planning and consideration for his men, using tanks, aircraft, artillery and infantry in an aggressive and well-planned attack. His Australians took the village of Hamel, with lower casualties than usual.
How'd it go? Like clockwork. Makes a nice change, doesn't it?
Monash had planned for the battle to take 90 minutes. It took 93. Finally, the Australians had the leadership they craved. The Allies began to turn defence into attack. In August, along with the Canadians, the Australians delivered a mortal blow on what the Germans described as their Black Day. They advanced nearly 20 kilometres, taking thousands of prisoners. They took Mons and Quentin and were thrown in again at the Hindenburg line.
By August, the logistics was incredible. Village Brett, planes practically wingtip to wingtip, tanks, guns, howitzers, you name it. It was fantastic. So seeing this build up, there was a feeling of confidence. You know, the way to have a go. And when the advance started, everyone felt ready. This is real, we're ready, going to do something.
But by now, no battalion had more than a quarter of its men left. They were ragged, ill and exhausted past the telling.
From July until Armistice Day, that was a war. That was worse than all the rest of it put together. Especially September and August, September. I suppose our battalion was engaged in bashing at the Germans, advancing against them 2 and 3 times a day. You didn't have much rest. I went for 2.5 days without any sleep. Hardly had time to eat.
I feel as though I've lost touch with any life but the one of war. It's hard to recall Australia, and apart from my people, nothing stands out vividly. I feel an outsider. Or lost in the magnitude of our task.
Then swiftly, shockingly, things changed.
Boys, you've all just lost your jobs. As of 1100 tomorrow, an armistice. All finny.
It was November the 11th, 1918. Since March, the Australians had defeated 39 enemy divisions, captured 23% of all prisoners taken by the British, and over 20% of the ground. They made up 10% of the British Army.
I had a fair supply of French francs. There were no shortage of attractive girls, and I had a good night. I didn't get back to the hotel, as a matter of fact, but quite a good night.
Celebrations, I was in London. People, my God, they were thick as flies. Oh, they were cheering, and of course it was a great let-up for them.
People just went mad. Everybody went to town, and they played up, they all laughed, and that was a great night, I can remember that.
Our battalion, the father and mother of unforgettable years, was drifting to pieces. The links that connected us with the unforgotten dead seemed to be snapped one by one. As each draft left, mateship was surrendered, usually forever.
It would take 2 years to bring them all home.
We were a good while getting back. Being sergeants, we were kept back. Missed a lot of boats, several boats. Promised 3 different boats, and at the last minute we were pulled off.
There were too few ships, and many men entered into training courses set up for them in England, the place they called Blighty.
Take me back to dear old Aussie. Put me on a boat to Sydney town. Take me over there, dump me anywhere. Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, well I don't care. I just want to see my best girl. Cuddling up again we soon shall be. Blighty is a failure, take me to Australia. Aussie is the place to be. Blighty is a failure, take me to Australia. Aussie is the place for me.
I was home for 3 or 4 days, and I went down to Hobart and got my job there. I was home for another couple of days, and I went down and started work 14 days after I was discharged. I was working, I didn't have any celebrations.
Well, when you got back, these people that hadn't gone to the war, they'd been advanced, and for instance, when I got back, the audit office was supposed to preserve my seniority. Well, between me and the man next senior to me, there were 4. So I had contempt. Here were 4 men who didn't go to the war, were promoted in the service ahead of me, and this was the general feeling. So you had rather a feeling of contempt for them. They were cold-footed bastards.
You got a great thrill when you come back. You're back in Australia, But then it wore off, and then, as I said, I had very near had a nervous breakdown. It's a strange feeling you get, a breakdown, nervous breakdown. Well, you know what people get it now. Yeah, everything goes wrong. Yeah. You dream of it. You're not too bad in the daytime, but you dream of it, you see. When you go to sleep, you're back at the war again.
I put it out of my mind when I came back. Put the war right out of my mind. That's why I never joined the RSL or never took any part in anything like that. War celebrations or that, I avoided them. I suppose that probably might have helped. I didn't have any dreams about them, but I didn't want any anyhow. Some nasty sights, you know, you see it in a war. You don't want to dream about them.
We used to get the exhibition and watch the speed races, the bike races. And after the races one night, they put on a display of fireworks. And they let off the skyrockets all at once. Fortunately, I wasn't holding the baby. And the noise of those skyrockets going off was just repeated the steam exhaust noise. I fell to the ground and vomited. And that was 1924.
I think it was the effects of war that my eldest brother, he passed on. He wasn't very strong after he come back. And there were so many of them killed. You know. Our brothers had mates that got killed. Only young lads. Lasted a long time, didn't it? Yeah. And what was gained out of it, I wonder, in the end?
Steadfast until death. Just the men that Australians at home know them to be. Into the place with a joke, a dry, cynical Australian joke as often as not. Holding fast through anything that man can imagine. They're not heroes. They do not intend to be thought or spoken of as heroes. They're just ordinary Australians, doing their particular work as their country would wish them to do it. And pray God, Australians in days to come will be worthy of them.